quick 1-minute overview of yesterday for the people, especially the ones, for the people, if possible. For the people who were not here yesterday, we had 3 lectures. We spoke about terminology concerning Christology, just learning the lingo. So when we speak about different things in Christology, we have we're speaking on the same terms, the same plane. So this is the first thing. The second thing is, and also we defined our own Christology. The second thing is, we spoke about Nestorianism in the first council of Ephesus. And the most important thing about Nestorianism, putting all the history aside, is basically 2 things. The first thing being that he did not believe in a true union of natures. They believed in what was called the prosopic union. So this prosopic union, if you remember that slide, there was 2 circles, the man and the logos, and they have some sort of conjunction, right, or interaction with each other as a moral union, as they said. And then what was seen in the end was one prosopon at the end. That's how he defined his union, or the oneness. So that's the prosopic union. It's not a union. It's not a real union. What we believe in is a hypostatic union and a natural union. Okay? And the analogies that we used were red hot iron, the live coal, and the human person. Okay? The body and the soul together. They were willing, but they said hypostatic. Okay, when we read Chelsea, okay? They were willing to say hypostatic union, or one hypostasis, on the basis that hypostasis was, for the Antiochians, one hypostasis meant one prosopon. They used it as a synonym for prosopon. They didn't consider it the same as what St. Cyril was talking about. Okay? So that's Nestorianism. Okay? What happened was Nestorianism continued on. And then we get into the issue of Eutyches. Eutyches, he was condemned from people who were trying to get him to say distorted Christology. That's why he was condemned. And he wasn't very clear in his own terms to begin with. So he appealed. Then they had the Second Council of Ephesus in 449, which was considered to be an ecumenical council. St. Dioscorus presiding was called by the Emperor Theodosius. Eutyches was brought back. He was absolved. The condemnation against him was annulled because what he said at the council was an Orthodox faith. He was brought back not just by Pope Dioscorus, he was brought back by the whole council. So it wasn't the solitary one person did everything. No, they all brought him back. Okay? And then the rest of the Nestorians that were still around were condemned, including, I'm just going to say the names quickly because they come up in the Council of Chalcedon. Ibes of Edessa, the one who said, I don't envy Christ, right? Because if he became God, so can I. These sorts of things. The Jews, they shouldn't feel anything about crucifying him because they just crucified a mere man. Okay? Ibes said he said worse things than the stories. Okay? So he was condemned. Theodoret was condemned, who was kind of the arch enemy, arch rival of Pope Cyril. And Domnus of Antioch was also condemned, amongst others, for several different things. The other thing that comes out of it, from that council, is that the Tome of Leo was never read, which is really what continues on to the Council of Chalcedon. If it wasn't for that one issue, we may never have had the Council of Chalcedon. Okay? Because that's what kind of set off everything. Okay? So, Ephesus 2. Eutyches' condemnation was annulled. Flavian of Constantinople and Eusebius were condemned and deposed. And we said that Theodoret, Ibes, and Domnus were also deposed for being Nestorian. Okay. What leads to Chalcedon? The Tome of Leo was never read. Okay? The Tome of Leo was never read. And there's 2 things associated here. Eutyches was exonerate, yes?
I'm sorry, can you just recap the Tome of Leo?
Okay, the Tome of Leo was the letter that Leo had written to Flavian after Eutyches was condemned at the home synod of Constantinople in 448. So in that letter, he tells Flavian basically what his Christology is. All right? And he believes that this is the Christology. This is the faith of the church. Okay? This is Leo's opinion. Unfortunately, it was distorted. But what he did was, he wrote to Flavian, and even when the second council of Ephesus was called, he had written to the emperor saying that he never thought that a council needed to be called, because he already declared what the faith was. So he had written his tome, and then when the council convened, he sent his tome with his delegation, and then, okay, you see the picture there.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, later on in the next lecture, God willing, we'll talk about why we don't accept the Tome of Leo. All this time we keep speaking about the Tome of Leo, and we've been talking about what's in the Tome of Leo and why we don't accept it. But we're going to get to that in the next lecture, God willing. We get to this. Okay? So, again, Leo of Rome was not happy because he believed the tome was the expression of faith in terms of Christology, and it was never read. Number two, in that letter, he believed that Eutychius should have been condemned, even though in expressing Eutychius' faith, Eutychius' error, Leo was wrong. The way he expressed it was wrong. Okay, it was incorrect. So when Eutychius is exonerated and his letter is never read, this kind of spark started flying. Okay? So he appealed several times. He wrote letters to the emperor, and he wrote letters to several women in the royal household, and he was fighting for another council to be held. And he kept on being refused. Over and over and over again. So what happened was, okay, the next slide. What happened was, in July 28, 450 AD, Emperor Theodosius II, he died suddenly from a riding accident while he was hungry. So you remember when we go back to the Council of Ephesus, how influential his older sister was, Pulcheria, right? And that she was celibate, and she was a nun, and she consecrated her life to Christ. Okay, she gets married. Okay? And she marries a military commander, his name is Marcian, and he becomes the emperor. And they automatically assume a pro-Roman policy. And she's already friends with Leo of Rome. So there's a couple letters that go back and forth. And there's some actions that are taken. Eutychius is degraded and detained. All of a sudden, without any counsel. Purely on the request of the Pope of Rome. Alright? And the second thing that happens is the chamberlain, Chrysephius, for whom Eutychius was his godfather, Chrysephius was executed. He was the chamberlain for Theodosius. So later on in that year, on 22nd of November 450, Pulcheria wrote a letter to Pope Leo, and she assures him that Anatolius has signed the tome. Anatolius is now the Bishop of Constantinople, after Flavian was deposed in Second Ephesus. And Anatolius was the one that St. Dioscorus had chosen. I want you to see how this plays out, right? He is the new Patriarch of Constantinople. He signs the Tome of Leo. All right? And she asks Pope Leo to convene a new council and informs him that Flavian's remains have been brought to Constantinople. This is after he passed away. And that the bishops deposed at Ephesus have returned from exile. So you see everything is just turning around 180 degrees. Everything is changing. The whole tide is turning. So, on the 13th of April, 451, Leo of Rome, he wrote to Anatolius of Constantinople, insisting that the names of Dioscorus and his fellow chairman at Ephesus too, Juvenal of Jerusalem and Eustathius of Berytus, should be excised from the diptychs. Now, what does this mean? The diptych is, you know how at a certain part of the liturgy, he prays for the living, right? Peace of the church and the pope and the bishops and the deacons and all of this is one side. And then he prays for the departed. This is the diptych. It's two faces, right? Of the church. Those who are in the flesh and those who have departed. Okay? So this is the diptych. When a patriarch or a bishop is in the diptych, is being mentioned in the diptych, it means we have the same faith. If he's there and his name is taken out, it means that they have severed relations, or that he's excommunicated. So Leo takes the first step, and he's the one who automatically separates from St. Dioscorus and the other leaders at Ephesus too, Juvenal of Jerusalem and Eustathius of Berytus. Okay? Leo then writes to Pulcheria, envisaging the disciplinary matters being resolved by his own legates, and Anatolius of Constantinople acting in concert, and presses that Eutyches be sent into distant exile. Anatolius and Maximus formally subscribed to the tome. The agents of Marcian and Anatolius were active in collecting signatures from the bishops, and the only ones that hadn't signed were Pope Dioscorus and his bishops, and Juvenal of Jerusalem, who was the co-chairman of Ephesus too. So discussions quickly turned to having a new council. The Pope preferred that it would be postponed until times were more favorable, but he found that his advice was unheeded. There were some wars going on, and the emperor was trying to fight off the Huns on a certain front. So the Pope said, not now, but it turned out that he was not listened to. And from the very beginning, he wanted the council to be held in Italy to begin with, so he would have control over it. He himself did not go to the council, but he sent a delegation, expecting that delegation would preside over the council. One of them, his name is important to know, Pescasinos, all right? Because he ends up presiding over the third session, which we're going to talk about in a second. The other important thing to know is that they didn't know Greek. Most of them didn't know Greek. One of them did, and Pescasinos' Greek was, mild at best. So his understanding of what was going on, and the documents that were being read, and all the discussions that were going on had to be through an interpreter. Okay? Which creates some limit in him and his judgment of matters to begin with. Not that it really mattered, because he came with an agenda. Alright? And then Leo, he calls the second council of Ephesus the robbers' council, Latrocinium. And that's why when you speak with people about second Ephesus today, they call it the robber council. The council of robbers. Why? Because Leo was the one who coined that term. Okay, the Leo of Rome. Now, what was the setting of the council of Ephesus? On May 23rd, 451, Marcian, he sent out letters summoning the bishops to a council that would meet in September in the city of Nicaea, not Chelsea. Now, why do you think he chose Nicaea? He chose Nicaea because he wanted to be the second Constantine. Okay? He wanted to be the one who came out with the definition of faith. The one who, proclaimed Christianity to the empire, these sorts of things. Okay? He wanted a name for himself. So it was supposed to be in Nicaea. And it's interesting how there was a later tradition of the numbers. It's an incorrect number, but there was a tradition that came out later on that 636 bishops attended Chalcedon. All right? Which is double the 318 that were at Nicaea. So it was all kind of doctored to give this picture of them proclaiming the faith, all right, and then unifying the faith in the empire. Interestingly enough, Nestorius was also invited to the Council of Chalcedon from his exile. Yes? The emperor. Like we said, the whole tide was turning. Because the previous policy was all against Nestorius. So now that Marcian was in power and he was going along with Rome, Leo was already very sympathetic with Theodoret and all the friends of Nestorius. And Leo had actually already accepted Theodoret back. After he was condemned in second Ephesus, he accepted Theodoret back. I didn't put this in here, but Eusebius ended up going to Rome and he gave him sanctuary there. Eusebius of Dorilea, who was the accuser of Eutyches. And he himself, his tome was basically a Nestorian document. In fact, Nestorius, this may come up later, but Nestorius himself read the tome of Leo before the Council of Chalcedon and says, this is what I've been saying all along. Okay? Now, is that clear up? Right? So, He died soon after receiving an invitation. It's unclear exactly when he died, but most likely he died before he could ever make it to the council. The Roman delegates, they had warned the emperor that unless the emperor was present and he was involved in the council, they would not attend. And many of the bishops felt the same way. Or the other bishops, not Roman, yeah, many of the other bishops felt the same way. So Nicaea was kind of further away from the capital. And the emperor wouldn't be able to be involved as much in Nicaea because of, as we said, he was involved in military battles. So in order to get his close involvement, they moved it to Chalcedon, which was basically just a boat ride across the Bosphorus. Okay? So from Constantinople to Chalcedon, it was just a quick, and they did this sometimes in the council. In the minutes of the council, you see they go to get the opinion of the emperor and they come back to tell the council. Okay? That's how quick it was. All right? Most likely it was during this period of time that St. Dioscorus, while the bishops were in Nicaea, that he had seen the tome of Leo, and he excommunicated him on the spot after reading the tome, because of him speaking about tu persona, or tu persopoi, okay? And speaking about how one form alternates with the other, okay? And how our Lord Jesus Christ does certain things. Marcian, he asked the bishops already assembled in Nicaea in September 451 to relocate in Chalcedon, and the council was delayed until the 8th of October. They gathered in the church of St. Euphemia on a hill outside Chalcedon, and there were 16 sessions, extending from the 8th of October to the 1st of November. Most of the sessions were presided by the imperial legates. Most of the sessions were presided by imperial officials, not bishops. Okay? Pay attention to this. It was only the third session that was presided by the Roman legates, by Pescacinus. Okay? And it was that session when they had the trial and condemnation of St. Dioscorus. Alright? And this is the way that it was set up. The imperial commissioners sat in the middle, in front of the rails of the sanctuary. On their left were seated Leo's representatives, the archbishops Anatolius of Constantinople and Maximus of Antioch, Thalassius of Caesarea, and the bishops of Syria and Asia Minor. These are all the opponents of St. Dioscorus at the present time. On the other side was seated St. Dioscorus, Juvenal of Jerusalem, and the bishops of Palestine and Illyricum, as well as those of Egypt. And then they put the Gospels in the center, and the center space was reserved for those speaking, for those presenting accusations, or those present as defendants. The approximate number of bishops that were there was about 370 based on the signatures. Official sources later on mentioned 500 or 520. The reason we went through the whole setting of where they sat is because there are some very dramatic things that happened during the council, and you kind of have to see it as if we were there. So the very first thing that happens when they opened the first session on October 8th is that the Roman papal legates immediately demanded that Pope Dioscorus not take a seat with the assembly of bishops. The imperial officials conceded, and Pope Dioscorus took a seat in the center as a defendant. He didn't sit with the bishops. So from the first minute, he was put as if he was put on trial. So the issue here at Chalcedon wasn't about Eutychius. Chalcedon was about St. Dioscorus. That was one of the headlines. That was one of the reasons, one of the agendas. Okay? So Eusebius of Dorylaeum, remember he was the accuser of Eutychius, and then he was condemned in 2nd Ephesus, and then afterwards Leo takes him and kind of embraces him. Okay? Eusebius of Dorylaeum, the accuser of Eutychius, presented a petition against St. Dioscorus of trying to establish the heresy of Eutychius, which is of course not true. It's a false accusation. St. Dioscorus answered, the Council of 449 had been convened by the Emperor, number one. He's not the one who convened the council. Number two, it made its decision after examining the proceedings of the Synod of 448, the home Synod of Constantinople, which were all recorded in the council's minutes, and that the minutes might be read to see what happened. Immediately the commissioners ordered the reading of the minutes. Now, while they're reading the minutes, something kind of dramatic here happens. The magistrates ordered that Theodoret of Cyrus, now he had just been condemned, right? And he was kind of, as we said, the arch rival of, at least intellectually, of St. Cyril. They ordered that Theodoret of Cyrus should be brought in, because Leo had quote-unquote restored him to his episcopate. Again, he was condemned by a council, but somehow Leo has some sort of overarching authority over everybody else, over ecumenical councils. And the emperor had ordered him to attend the council. So he entered accordingly. Now, we should note here that the second council of Ephesus, its decisions and judgments had not been reversed formally. So asking Theodoret to come and to attend and to be present, and by the way, from the second session on, he acted as a full member of the council. And he hadn't been brought back formally to the church yet, after his condemnation. So what happens is, of course, there's a big, I'm not going through all the drama on the council. If you want to read it, there's the Acts of the Council of Chalcedon, about a lot of shouting and a lot of, cast out the enemy of Cyril, cast out the Nestorian, he's an Nestorian, a lot of shouting, but in the end he ended up staying. Okay? St. Dioscorus, he complained that he had not acted at Ephesus II alone, but that all of the bishops were involved in the decisions made and they all signed. Not just bringing back Eutychides, but the condemnations of the other bishops. The bishops who also attended Ephesus II, now this is kind of claimed that they signed the decisions involuntarily by force. And some even claimed that they signed a blank paper. Pope Dioscorus' supporters began deserting him in a dramatic fashion. Remember how I told you there were two sides? There was the supporters of Leo and the supporters of the Tome of Leo and against St. Dioscorus, and there was St. Dioscorus and his supporters, right? And Juvenal in particular. Juvenal gets up and walks over to the other side, and he sits down. Okay? This is all recorded in the minutes. This is all history, I'm telling you. Okay? Everyone except the Egyptian bishops and only temporarily the Illyrian and Palestinian bishops. The interesting thing about the Illyrian bishops is they were under they're under the jurisdiction of the Pope of Rome, but they were willing to stand up for a period of time. At the end of the first session, without asking the bishops for their opinion, the late chairman delivered his verdict that Dioscorus and 5 other bishops, namely Juvenal of Jerusalem, Thalassius of Caesarea, Eusebius of Ankara, Eustathius of Berytus, and Basil of Seleucia, who had played a leading role at Ephesus II, would be deposed. The bishops approved the decision by acclamation, meaning what? Kind of the first one gets up and says, so be it, and they all agree, basically. Finally, the chairman asked the bishops to draw professions of their faith on paper. And this leads us to the second session. So basically, the first session is dedicated to what? Getting rid of St. Dioscorus and all the major players at Ephesus II, and bringing back certain major historian figures. Okay? I'm kind of leaving out a lot of the meaty details in the middle. It's for the sake of time. Okay? In session 2, which is on October 10th, the government now revealed its plan. Leo had his agenda. The government had their agenda. And sometimes they coincided. So the government now revealed its plan. The bishops were to draw a new definition of faith. Okay? This created a ruckus. it really created vigorous protest. Why? Because in the first ecumenical council of Ephesus, Canon 7 of that council forbade the writing of any new definition of faith except the Creed of Nicaea, the Nicene Creed written by the 318 Fathers. Alright? So there was vigorous protest. But the late chairman simply ignored all these protests. The session was largely taken up by the reading of creedal and dogmatic documents, including Leo's tome. The reading went smoothly except for when Leo's tome was read. And when the tome was read, there was a lot of objection. Again, a lot of shouting and interruptions. Several times by the Illyrian and Palestinian bishops, the ones who were siding with St. Dioscorus. There was one bishop called Atticus of Nicopolis who suggested that the bishops be given a few days to put together a formulation agreement with the letters of St. Cyril, written to Nestorius, including the 12 chapters. If you remember, the 12 chapters were kind of the uncompromising statements that the synod with St. Cyril and Alexandria put together for Nestorius either he accepted or he'd be deposed and excommunicated. So what happened here, when he suggested that it was agreed upon by the other bishops, and the officials allowed them to meet in the residence of Archbishop Anatolius of Constantinople, provided that the bishops who attended were selected from only those who signed the Tome of Leo. Now here, this was kind of a political play. Why? If they had opened up this can of worms, trying to compare Leo's tome to the 12 anathemas, okay, something bad would have happened. Leo himself would have been excommunicated or whatever. They are incompatible. The tome of Leo and the 12 anathemas of St. Cyril are incompatible. And notice again, remember we said before that the 12 anathemas were accepted at the first council of Ephesus, okay, as dogmatic statements that were accepted ecumenically. Alright? So the imperial legates, they kind of say, well, okay, fine, yeah, we agree, you get together and you discuss the, along with Anatolius the Archbishop, and they need to bring up the 12 anathemas. Okay? They just kind of pushed it aside and then bring it up again. Supporters of St. Dioscorus demanded that participation in the council be restored to him and the other leading bishops that had been suspended. But they were outcried by bishops from the Orient, and the Antiochian bishops, and the clerics of Constantinople. The response of the officials is not recorded, but a negative one was implied. So the end of the second session is they're forced to put together a definition of faith. Alright? And there's some discussion about the Tome of Leo. The third session, October 13th. This session is dedicated to the trial and condemnation of St. Dioscorus. It was a special formal meeting. In fact, when the second session had adjourned, the imperial legates had 5 days. We'll get back together in 5 days. They got back together in 3 days without the imperial legates. Kind of, again, this is all doctrine. Alright? Paschasinos and the papal Roman legates are the ones who preside over the session, and it's directed against St. Dioscorus. The lay commissioners were not there. The attendance there, remember we said most likely 370 bishops were there. Only 192 attended. So it was a very weak showing. Why? Because they probably didn't agree with what was going on. But instead of voicing it, they just didn't show up. Alright? So what happens? Again, because it's a different scenario, the lay commissioners are not the ones presiding. It's Paschasinos and the Roman legates who are presiding. Eusebius of Dorylaeum again set forth his charges against St. Dioscorus, and he accuses him of misconduct at the Council of Ephesus too, and of sharing the heresy of Eutychius. Same as what he said before. St. Dioscorus at this time, as we said, he was deposed, okay? By the lay commissioners at least, alright? And he is under guard by imperial guards. So St. Dioscorus, he was summoned, like the other bishops, to this session. You know, surprise, surprise, he wasn't summoned to the second session. Okay? But here he was summoned. And had sent word that he was willing to come, but that his guards prevented him. So 2 priests were sent, and then later on 3 bishops, with a notary to meet him at the lodgings where he is staying and summon him to appear before the council. They found him and delivered to him the message in writing. He stated that he intended on going, but that he was under imperial guard and therefore prevented from doing so. So the bishops finally received permission for his attendance. And when that happened, he said he requested that the imperial officials also be present. Why? Because they were present in the first session. And they're the ones that made the decision. So, Amphilochius, trying to postpone the issue for a couple more days. Now, Amphilochius, he's a nice figure to know in this council because he repeatedly goes against what's going on here. He says, let the matter be postponed for 1 or 2 days. The proposal wasn't accepted, and then a second summons was sent to St. Dioscorus by the hands of 3 other bishops. He pleaded that he wasn't well, and that he must stipulate for the presence of the magistrates. He requested the emperor to grant this. But the envoy said, this is a canonical question that is raised, and laymen have no business with it. To put off coming is to strengthen your accusers. So St. Dioscorus said, let other bishops come with me. Eusebius attacks what we did in common. So they told him no, he accuses you individually. Okay? So what happens when he dismissed the 3 summons? False accusations were brought against St. Dioscorus by Alexandrian bishops. Oh, sorry, this is after the second summons. He hadn't received the third one yet. False accusations were brought against St. Dioscorus by Alexandrian priests. Of course, this is all doctored, and it's very similar to, if you know the history of St. Athanasius. After the Council of Nicaea, there was another council of Arian bishops who had condemned St. Athanasius, and all the accusations that were brought against him were totally bogus. They were very serious accusations that had no founding whatsoever. He killed somebody, he had the hand of someone who used it for magic, these sorts of things. Okay? Very kind of strange accusations. Okay? And it was obvious that it was doctored. Why? Because the 4 priests said almost exactly the same thing, which never happens. Alright? It shows that there was a common hand in everything. So a third summons was sent, but he finally refused and had nothing more to say than what he had said to the former envoys. So they decided to give him the penalty of deposition for ignoring the 3-fold summons from the council. Although the exact nature of the charges against St. Dioscorus was deliberately left vague. There was no clear accusation against St. Dioscorus. None. 8 different accusations were brought against him, and none of them were clear. Typically, when you have a trial, you have somebody there, and you bring the evidence, and you discuss what's going on. But you don't just bring charges against somebody and say, okay, it's deposed. That's not how it happens. So clearly this was all, again, this was all a setup, and it was all doctored, and he didn't have a chance from the beginning. So St. Dioscorus and the Second Council of Ephesus were never explicitly condemned as heretical, but instead rejected on grounds of lawlessness and violence. So after St. Dioscorus refused to heed the 3rd summons, Pescasinos, the senior Roman legate, as chairman, invited the judgment of the council fathers who condemned St. Dioscorus by acclamation and comments. So Pescasinos began with his deposition, and then they all just followed in order. There was no such thing as majority, there was no such thing as, okay? Yes?
So as far as I know, people talk about St. Dioscorus in Hebrew as things indicative of his faith. So why didn't he refuse?
He refused because he knew he didn't have, a couple of reasons. Number one, he didn't have a chance. He saw that everything was being stacked against him. is number one. Number two, the accusations brought against him weren't him individually. It was against the actions of a council, an ecumenical council. This is number two. The third reason is he kind of took the hit for everybody else. So he brought kind of all the heat on himself, all right, or accepted it, so that the others, whatever happened in the rest of the councils, the rest could kind of do things very, distant, not having to be attached to him or to his name. So he knew that everything was, as long as their names were attached to him, they wouldn't be able to get anything done, or anything done for, to be able to even defend the right faith or anything. I'm skipping over a lot. I'm skipping over a lot of the minutes and a lot of the details here. But the tide of the way things were going, from the very first minutes when they seat him as a defendant, it was obvious, and they had Theodoret walk in, it's obvious that the tide is totally against him. All right? And even before the council, Leo had excommunicated. All right? Yeah. Get rid of St. Dioscorus? Several different things. Number one, they had control of Egypt. Okay? They thought that they could impose their own patriarch there. See, the whole idea was that they thought if they could just put together their own definition of faith and have control over everything, that everything would be unified in the empire. Okay? Under Marcian, right? That's number one. Number two, ever since Constantinople had become the capital, there was always a big move to make Constantinople kind of the center of Christianity. Not just the imperial capital, but the religious one as well. Absolutely. Unfortunately, they were on the side of heresy as opposed to. Okay. Right. Okay. Now, the bishops really had no option but to follow the lead of their Roman papal chairman. Those who were unwilling to condemn St. Dioscorus simply absented themselves from the session. They didn't voice their opinion. They just didn't show up or didn't say anything. Didn't go. All right? The bishops had no option but to follow the lead of their Roman papal chairman. Those who were unwilling to condemn St. Dioscorus simply absented themselves from the session. So, and we have to note also the clear words of the Roman legates that St. Dioscorus was deposed, not by the assembly of bishops, but by the Pope of Rome. Again, another power play. Okay? Like I said, everybody had their agenda. Okay? Everyone went with their agenda, and sometimes it lined up. Rome and Constantinople were lined up in certain things, but as we see as the council moves on, Constantinople has its own agenda that Rome ends up disagreeing with. Okay? But for now, they're on the same page. The council sent a letter to Marcian and to others, extant only in Latin version, acquainting him with their verdict against St. Dioscorus. There were, as we said, there were 8 different accusations brought against St. Dioscorus. All of these accusations were unjustified, and they clearly showed that the deposition of St. Dioscorus was unjustified, and he remained the legal patriarch of Egypt even after his deposition in exile. What we're going to hear about in the next lecture, the aftermath of Chalcedon, is that when they tried to impose a new patriarch in Alexandria, he was utterly and totally refused by the people. They still considered St. Dioscorus as their patriarch, even in exile. Okay. So that's the end of the 3rd session. The 4th session. The lay commissioners come back. The decisions of the first 3 sessions are discussed. And then the Tome of Leo was acclaimed, signed and declared to be in harmony with the Nicene Creed, even by the Illyrian and Palestinian bishops, the ones who were against the Tome to begin with. You can see something's happening here. Something's going on behind the scenes. Clearly. If they were so opposed to it, and then all of a sudden, after St. Dioscorus is deposed, they all say, oh, we're okay with it. Something's happening here. The only ones who refused were Egyptian bishops. And then the bishops, other bishops that were there, requested the 5 who were deposed in the first session, except for St. Dioscorus, of course, be brought back. And the request was granted. Now that they had gotten rid of St. Dioscorus, it didn't matter who was there. And of course, they had already made deals with the rest of them. Afterwards, there were 2 unnumbered sessions dealing with certain issues. Corosus and Dorotheus were Constantinopolitan monks who still were with St. Dioscorus, but they didn't do anything to them. They kind of left them alone. Photius of Tyre and Eustathius of Berytus, there was an argument about jurisdiction. I don't want to get into all the details, okay? But you'll notice this happens in several of the sessions. Whenever there's arguments about jurisdiction, basically what happened was something was granted in 2nd Ephesus. And then, when they see the tide turning, the bishop who had something taken away from him goes and appeals to the emperor. It's brought up in Chalcedon and he's granted it again. It's brought back to him. Okay, this is the typical, trend of how certain things go. Yes?
Just to make sure, it's kind of saying Pope Leo, one of his objectives was to enroll the center church with that church.
I can't hear.
Pope Leo, that was one of his objectives was to make Rome the center church among the other churches, or like that church.
Leo, before the Council of Chalcedon, was already claiming the primacy of Rome. Again, there's a lot of details here I'm not telling you. Pope Dioscorus, when Pope Dioscorus came in 445, okay, to be the new patriarch after St. Cyril had passed away. St. Dioscorus was his deacon, his archdeacon. Okay? So he was consecrated as the patriarch of Alexandria. So Leo sends him a letter. And you know how typically you send a brotherly letter, a congratulatory letter? He sends him a letter saying, almost scolding him for certain differences in rites because they didn't follow exactly the rites that Rome was doing. And he called it wickedness. So, yeah. So, it was, he was always, and the way he wrote it, he said, it's unbelievable that, that the see of St. Mark doesn't do anything, or does something different, than what the see of Peter does since Mark was in. And he was clearly putting him down from day one. Okay, and there was a couple letters like this. Okay, Leo of Rome was always pushing the primacy of Rome from the very beginning. And I'm telling you facts, these are documents. Okay? These are documents that exist. Alright, yes?
Why did they choose St. Dioscorus specifically? I know you said that in the way this is true, but...
As the patriarch? As the scapegoat?
Yeah.
He was clearly the leader. He was clearly the leader of, if he wasn't the most senior bishop. Okay? At the time Theodosius had chosen him to preside over 2nd Ephesus, he was not the senior bishop. In fact, Juvenal most likely was. He was most likely the senior bishop. For some reason, St. Dioscorus was the one who was chosen. Why? Because the emperor had an agenda. He was the successor of Cyril, and he was trying to get rid of Nestorianism. Okay? So, since he was the one who presided over the council, and he was the patriarch of Alexandria, and Constantinople is trying to give seniority, and Rome is trying to, show their primacy. Of course, the scapegoat is going to be St. Dioscorus. Okay? I think this is it. All right. It's a political play. It's all politics. Okay? Yes?
So at that point, Alexander was leading role and playing all this stuff.
The history of Alexandria is that even politically, Rome was the heart of the empire, Alexandria was the mind of the empire, apart from religion. Okay? So, over time, the patriarchs of Alexandria showed that they were the ones who people went to settle issues in theology, theological disputes, and a lot of canonical disputes, and these sorts of things. In fact, there was a title given to the Pope of Alexandria at the time of St. Dioscorus that he was the judge of the world. And it's documented. Again, I'm telling you facts. And we say this, you know the hymn, Tu Macario? Okay? Creatus Ecumenis, the judge of the world. It's a title we say for him. Okay? So, this whole image, okay, was very disturbing to the other sees. Rome and Constantinople. Alright? Okay. So, at session 4, the Tome of Leo was acclaimed, signed and declared to be in harmony with the Nicene Creed, even by the Illyrian and Hessian bishops. The 5 returned, and there were the 2 unnumbered sessions. Okay, session 5, October 22nd. Remember in session 2, they asked the bishops to put together their own statements of faith. So a draft definition was submitted in this session. The draft definition no longer exists. We don't have it. And it's not included in the minutes. Pay attention to these points. Okay? There's no way that we can compare. Although we have some things that we can look at. It was agreed upon by all of the bishops, except John of Germanicia and the Roman legates. John of Germanicia was a known Diophysite and a friend of Theodoret. So this puts a question mark, okay, as to what's going on here. It looked like the draft definition was a Miaphysite formula, out of 2 natures. The officials proposed that a new commission be formed of all parties together with Archbishop Anatolius and the Roman legates in order to revise the draft. Pretty strange. Almost everybody agrees to it, except for a few bishops, and they put together a whole new commission that includes the Roman legates. Due to the bishops protesting, they protested putting together a new definition, a new draft. The officials said, and this is in the minutes, Dioscorus said that the reason for Phlegon's deposition was that he said there are 2 natures, but the definition has from 2 natures. Here, Archbishop Anatolius reacted saying, it was not because of the faith that Dioscorus was deposed. He was deposed because he broke off communion with the Lord Archbishop Leo and was summoned the 3rd time and did not come. The officials ignored this intervention and asked the bishop, do you accept the letter of Archbishop Leo? Okay? They replied, yes, we've accepted and signed it. The officials said that its content must be inserted in the definition. The bishops exclaimed, another definition must not be produced, nothing is lacking in the definition. Okay, so what happens here? We have a face-off, okay? We're at a standstill. The emperor is consulted. Remember, you could just kind of cross over the Bosporus and get the opinion of the emperor? So the emperor is consulted. What did he say? Either revise the draft or entrust the matter to a Roman council presided over by Pope Leo. Remember, in the very beginning, before the Council of Chalcedon, he wanted the council in Italy to begin with. And the Roman bishops, they said, either do what we say or we're going back. We're going to have our own council in Italy. Amazingly, the bishops still put up resistance, proclaiming, let the definition be confirmed or we shall leave. And again, the bishops of Illyricum said that those who dissent make themselves known. The dissenters are Nestorians. Let the dissenters go off to Rome. Thus the officials, as represented by the chairman, artfully put the question to the bishops in a modified way. Again, look at the tactic here. Dioscorus said, I accept from 2 natures, but I do not accept 2. But the Most Holy Archbishop Leo says that there are 2 natures in Christ, united without confusion, change or separation in the one only begotten Son, our Savior. So whom do you follow? The Most Holy Leo or Dioscorus? They just deposed Dioscorus, right? And of course now it would be bad form to go against Leo, so what did they say? The bishops answered, we believe as Leo does. This is on the minutes. The bishops yielded, and the draft was accordingly amended according to imperial will. The amending committee was obliged to assert a continuing duality in Christ, acknowledging in two natures. Remember I told you that this was the formula of Nestorius. In two natures. Acknowledge in two natures is a Nestorian formula. You have to put yourself in the history and the context of the day. If you said in two natures, you were automatically Nestorian. Yeah.
I'm just confused by the way they describe this formula, saying that there's two natures united without condition.
This is the same thing the Nestorian said. It's exactly what the Nestorian said. When they say two natures united, what does that mean? It's ambiguous. That was like the formula of reunion. It doesn't mean that it was a true union of two natures. He could continue in two natures and say, oh, they're one. Well, even Nestorius called it a prosopic union. Okay? They're playing with the words. Okay? The bishops yielded. Okay? They put together, they amended the definition. The amending committee was obliged to assert a continuing duality, replacing from two natures with acknowledged in two natures. Not just that, you have to put in context who is the one opposing the draft definition, and then they accept it afterwards. The ones who are opposing the draft out of two natures are Nestorians. The ones who accept it afterwards, after they say acknowledged in two natures, they accept it. So clearly there was a Nestorian acceptance of this definition. Okay? Don't just look at the words. Look at the people who are accepting it or denying it. And on what terms. Alright? The minutes conclude in the 5th session with the bishop's approval of the new text by acclamation. Yes, somebody had a question? No? Okay. 6th session, okay, is the signing of the Declaration of Faith. So this session is really like a gala, a gala occasion attended by the emperor and Pulcheria and 324 bishops or their representatives and high officials of state, and it opened by a self-congratulatory speech from the emperor in which he compared himself to his great predecessor Constantine in securing the unity of the church through unity of doctrine. His speech was followed by the inevitable acclamations by the bishops, of course, to Marcian, the new Constantine. And by the reading of the new definition, the total number of signatories amounted to 452. There was doubling, and there's a lot of bishops written there that weren't even there. It was kind of, if their metropolitan was there, they kind of put their names too. Okay, by association. And apart from the Egyptian bishops, all the bishops of the council were clearly required to sign. Amphilochius of Cid and Eustathius of Berytus signed under pressure. The story of Amphilochius is, I don't know, it's disappointing, but yeah. The archdeacon of Constantinople, his name is Aetius. So Amphilochius didn't want to sign it. Basically, they're out of it. And it's in the minutes. Okay? And he smacked him. Okay? And it's in the minutes. Alright? Shaking at the end. Okay. So the session So the session careful. The session, man. What happened to the deacon in the church of woman? The session was opened, said him congratulating himself. And Marcian said, quote, our serenity has judged, like the rhetoric here is, our serenity has judged it right and profitable that every future occasion for controversy over our holy religion should be removed. Therefore, if anyone, whether in private life or involved in government service or belonging to the clergy, publicly gathers a mob and under the pretext of holding a disputation about the faith causes disturbance, let him know that if he is enrolled as a private citizen, he will be expelled from the imperial city. Well, if he is a public servant or a cleric, he will endanger his service in the former case and his clerical rank in the latter, and be subjected to other penalties. And he accept it or accept the consequences. And now that the emperor's agenda was done, he allowed the bishops to take care of their own business. Okay? So the next several sessions are related to certain issues with the different bishops. Session 7 is an embarrassment. If the rest of it wasn't already. The 7th session was about Juvenal of Jerusalem. And the reason Juvenal switched sides was because they had granted him patriarchal status of Jerusalem and him having certain jurisdiction over certain areas. Literally, he was a traitor, and he sold the faith for the sake of the Patriarchate of Jerusalem. Okay? And he suffered for it. Okay? Later on. That's session 7. I'm not going to read all of this. Okay? It's not one of it. Session 8. Session 8 is the reinstatement of Theodoret. You can see how everything is turned 180 degrees. Theodoret is brought back. Okay? He had already been playing as a full member of the council, but they had, since he was, deposed in the previous council, Second Ephesus, they kind of had to formally bring him back. So when they bring him back, he wants to express his faith, and they tell him, excommunicate, say Nestorius is anathema. And he says, I'm going to express my faith here, I'm going to tell you. So they insisted that he had to anathematize Nestorius. Eventually he did it. Alright? And then in the very end of that session, Amphilochus of Syria, the one who didn't like what was going on to begin with, he was obliged to anathemize Eutychius. Okay? Yes?
So here he's saying that he refuses two sons.
No. Theodoret never went back on his Christology. Theodoret never went back on his Christology. You can say whatever is written there. There was a lot of things that were written in the council. Okay? He did it under, if he said anything, he did it under pressure. Okay? If he could say he refuses two sons, but that's the ultimate result of his Christology.
It's almost suggesting that there's Christology between Nestorianism
See?
and Cyril's formula, which is Leo's
No,
formula.
Leo's is Nestorian, okay? Leo's formula is Nestorian. He can say it's not, but it is. Alright? The middle part is actually Chalcedon. Okay? Yeah, clearly Nestorius, he says two natures, two hypostases, two persons, okay? It's very clear. And that's the logical, end point. St. Cyril, Miaphysis, one nature, one person, one hypostasis, one, okay? Chalcedon says, acknowledge one hypostasis acknowledged in two natures. How does that work? It doesn't make sense. Was he schizophrenic? Was he? It doesn't make sense for us. It's not logical.
Because also you said the first definition of faith that we had to talk with, well, it's written by bishops and it's signed the Tomb of Leo, but it's rejected by.
It was all about, they signed the Tomb of Leo out of pressure. It was pressure put upon them. The emperor, once they saw that the emperor clearly has a pro-Roman policy, and all of a sudden they get the Tomb of Leo. So what do? And Anatolius, who was chosen by St. Dioscorus, signs the Tomb of Leo. What is that all about? We'll find out in the last session, right? Yeah.
So, Leo's thinking of Miaphysite, or the way he said it, I'm confused with.
No, he's not. He's not a Miaphysite.
No, but does he think he is? Like, the way he said it,
He doesn't care. Whatever he says is the faith. He doesn't put himself in any category. He is the category. Seriously, I'm not joking. Understood? Okay. بسرعة عشان
So the author basically, he condemned the stories who's like, they collaborated together, that whole historianism was their idea altogether. But then he goes and agrees with the Pope of Leo, which is basically his same belief all over again. It's basically just taking a whole shenanigan. Okay, got it.
Okay. Remember, he was excommunicated by the Second Council of Ephesus. And even without a Second Council, Leo takes him back. And that's why he was brought back in the first session of Chalcedon. Okay? Okay, this is...
We shouldn't move that, this is really mad.
It's a horror movie. Okay. Sessions 9 and 10. Okay? Very quick. Sessions 9 and 10. Session 9, they bring up the issue of Ebes and Vedesa again. Remember Ebes, when you look at Ebes his situation, you'd think there's no way this guy would be accepted by any side. Okay? Okay? And he wrote a letter to Mary the Persian. Okay? So it's just an embarrassment. Yeah, they bring back Ebes, and what they do in order to bring back Ebes is the following. When they start to bring up his previous, faults, all right, and his misdemeanors and all the things he was doing before, and all the things that he said, when they didn't even get to all that because they were going to go back and read the minutes, all right? They were going to go back and read the minutes for Ephesus 2. When they came to the issue of Ebes, they knew it was going to be an embarrassment. So what do? They go and they say, the Roman legates, they stand up and they say that Ephesus is null and void. It's null and void. So we don't have no need to go through all this. And then afterwards, so in this, the more important issue that happened in session 10 is that Ephesus 2 is formally annulled and voided. Which they'd already done, basically. I mean, they basically overturned everything that happened there, almost. And in the rest of the sessions, they continue to go through that policy. When they bring back Ebes, some of the comments that come out, Pescasinos, remember, he doesn't know, he's not very good at Greek. So, all he knows is Latin. So he speaks about Ebes as the most orthodox. Okay? Yeah, I don't envy Christ, If he can become God, then so can I, right? And the Jews, they shouldn't feel that they've done anything because really, they just crucified a mere man. I get it. Alright? So Ephesus 2 is annulled, and that's why Abuna explained yesterday that what we have for the second session of Ephesus 2 are the Syriac Acts. We don't have them from the reading in Chalcedon, in their minutes, because it was annulled at this point. Alright? Now, Domnus, he wasn't brought back because it would have been another embarrassment. He didn't push for reinstatement at Antioch, so he just kind of accepted attention for the rest of his life. All right. Then sessions 11 through 15 for the sake of time. And again, these are all jurisdictional issues. And to make a long story short, there's two main issues here. The first issue is that if somebody had lost something in Ephesus 2 and somebody appealed, they got it back in Chalcedon. It was basically an overturning of what happened in Ephesus 2. The second point is if there was an issue with Constantinople, even as a side issue in what was brought up, or the complaint that was made, the rights of the See of Constantinople, over these different areas had to be preserved. Okay? Now you see the agenda of Constantinople here. Okay? Rome got its way. The emperor got his way. Now, the Patriarch of Constantinople wants to get his way. Alright? I'm sorry to say this way, but this is what happened. And we have to know what happened at this council and why we reject it. Alright? The last session. 16. The last session was an appeal by the Roman legates against a decree which was later called Canon 28 of Chalcedon, adopted at an informal meeting of the bishops on the previous day, which recognized Constantinople as the first see in the East, ranking above Alexandria and Antioch, and assigned it authority over the bishoprics in Thrace, Asia, and Pontus. But the canon was adopted over their strenuous objections. Why did Rome reject this canon? Huh? Well, they already were the top. So why did they reject it? They didn't want a number 2. There was no number 2. Basically. Alright? What is that? But Constantinople here ended up prevailing on this issue. Okay? And it was passed as a canon by the bishops. Okay? Rome rejected it up until there was a split between Rome and Constantinople later on, 500-600 years later. And then finally, after one of their own synods, they ended up, at the time of the Crusades, they ended up appointing their own Bishop of Constantinople, their own delegate in Constantinople, and gave him rights, that were second to Rome. Why? Because they were under him. And no, after they split from them, after they appointed their own there. So Constantinople, they tried to have their own status by themselves. Rome didn't want it. And they didn't accept Canon 28 until after there was a split with Constantinople, 600 years later, sorry.
But only when they said their own.
Only when they said their own, right. So he would be under them.
It's just.
Right. Okay, so, all right. This issue began in the Ecumenical Council of Constantinople in 381. Canon 3 of the Council of Constantinople in 381 tries to say that since Constantinople is New Rome, therefore it has basically jurisdiction over it. The same thing what Canon 28 says, basically. Rome didn't accept it then either, for the same reason. And we didn't accept it, even though there was an Alexandrian delegation in the Council of Constantinople in 381, we left the council. We removed ourselves from, why? Because in Christianity there's no 1, 2, 3, 4. And we're brothers. Okay? And until today, the way that we deal with each other, with the other churches that we have, we're in communion with, the most senior one is the one who basically is kind of leads the group. Okay? It's about seniority. It's not about primacy. And even in seniority, they deal with each other as brothers. And this goes against the commandment of Christ. Remember when the disciples were arguing who would be the greatest? And he said, whoever is the greatest will be what? The least and the servant of all. Do your brothers. One is greater than the other. So we left the council altogether. And we never accepted Canon 3 of Constantinople 381. And when it was brought up here, we were already out of the picture. We were gone. Okay? But the Melkite Patriarch, the one imposed upon Alexandria, of course, had to follow whatever this was. And in other places. Okay? So everybody ends up getting their way, except for us. I can tell you. Alright? We got the brunt of it. Yes, in fact, he's called the first among equals. And when he says he's the first among equals, it doesn't matter if he's senior to them or he's not. He could be the youngest one or the last one ordained. He's still the first among equals. You see the difference? The Bishop of Constantinople, the Archbishop of Constantinople, always has primacy over the other patriarchs in the Eastern Orthodox churches. You see how that works? And that's why until this day in Greece, they don't have a patriarch, they have an archbishop. Formally. Okay? Clear? Yes.
Leaving session, it seems very defeatist. It seems like that's like the opposite of what it should be.
No. It's not defeatist. It's making a statement. There's a difference. It's not like, man, do whatever you want. No, that's not what they were doing. They were trying to make a statement that what you're doing is wrong, and we don't agree with it. I'm talking about in 381. No, it actually, like I said, it didn't go very well. It didn't go well at all. And that's why ever since 381, remember how I told you that Constantinople was trying to get into the affairs of Ephesus? Right? Ephesus continuously rejected what was going on from Constantinople. They didn't like it either. Well, no, I was going to say something, we'll stop there. Right, yeah. It was. It said out of two natures. No, it's not. The draft definition as a document is not recorded. But from the statements that occurred later on in the minutes, it appears that in the draft definition it said out of two natures. They rejected the draft definition. No. I said the Roman delegates. No, one. His name was John of Germanisha. He was not of the Roman delegation. And the Roman delegation rejected the draft definition. Okay? Okay, yes, very quickly.
All of us are meetings, and then what was the verdict on that?
Eutychus was just like a title, right? For the sake of everybody getting their what they wanted in the end.
Okay, but what happens with did something what he says after the order to leave?
No. At the council of Chalcedon, remember Abuna yesterday he told you that Saint Dioscorus in Chalcedon conditionally condemned Eutychus. He said, if Eutychus said this, him or anybody else, my concern is for no person. My concern is for the faith. Let him be anathema. Alright? So our concern wasn't Eutychus as a person. Our concern was the faith. Alright? And many of our fathers, almost all of them later on, condemned him. Even though they agreed that his reception back into the church at Second Ephesus was justified based on what he had said. No, when? In Ephesus 2, everybody took it back. Not just us, but that's what St. Dioscorus was saying. He said the decisions there wasn't mine personally. It was all the bishops. They agreed. So why is he attacking me? He was the scapegoat. Got it? Yes.
Sorry. Session 8. Theodore, he says nothing of the stories, isn't story?
As I said, they were willing to sacrifice Nestorius for the sake of them continuing whatever they were doing.
Why is that? They believe
Because sometimes when you're associated with a person or a name, it's much more dangerous.
it's the same beliefs.
Yes, he was one of the same as Nestorius.
Okay, well, this part right here says, and to whoever does not say the Holy Virgin Mary is so of course, and to whoever divides the only begotten Son into two sons. And if we're going back to Orthodox.
Just want to read. It says finally, he was pushed to say it.
They only believe that Holy Virgin Mary is so of course, and that.
Yeah, later on, like I said, Theodoret, okay? Theodoret, he was, the whole Antiochian side was willing to sacrifice certain things on paper or verbally for the sake of them not being attached to Nestorius. They could teach whatever they wanted in the name of their other fathers. But if they were attached to Nestorius, okay, they were considered to be heretic. Huh? Theodoret didn't believe in what he said, you're kidding me? Huh? He said, in fact, he said, guys, please. Okay? In fact, Theodoret said, even if you cut off my two hands, I won't sign a deposition for Nestorius. Well, he couldn't if he had his two hands cut off. But the point is, all right? But that's really what he said. He's saying, and you do whatever you want to do to me, it's not going to happen.
This was his promise to the students. He said it.
This is what he said earlier on, and now he's saying the exact opposite. This wasn't a change of mind.
What about the Indian Commission?
Huh?
I said, what about the Indian Commission? They signed for another definition.
I have to look back in minutes, I can't remember. About who,
Is there,
but they had already signed the Tome of Leo too.
okay, but you're saying that the ones, people were voters.
The main people who opposed the draft definition were John of Germanisha, who was an historian, okay, and the Roman legates.
How do we know if everyone is signing it?
Because the way that things are swinging, and some of the comments that come out in the minutes. I didn't read you all the minutes. I mean, we'd be here all week, okay, just on the Council of Chalcedon. But if you're interested in looking at the minutes themselves, they exist. There's a 3-volume set by Price, Richard Price, where he translates all the minutes with his comments too. Okay, and that's where we get a lot of this information. Okay,
Sorry.
go ahead.
Why does Leo want to say this part? He doesn't even read.
It's all about association. It's all about who you're following now. None of the stuff has to do with the faith anymore. Are you kidding me? Ever since the first session, it has nothing to do with the faith anymore. It's all about agendas and what people want, and the emperor and Leo, and that's what the whole council is about. It has nothing to do with the faith.
We'll continue to get this.
We've been out. We were out from the first session.
The other two committee councils were more related to the faith?
I can't hear you.
The other two committee councils in the Eastern Orthodox Church was more adding to this about the faith because they noticed.
I'm going to give you a history afterwards.
Okay.
Okay? The next lecture is about 200 years of history. Yeah.
This information or like something in general came to us from the Oriental Orthodox perspective or from,
Okay, I'll tell you now. Price, the one who translated the minutes, all right, has his own comments that are kind of not very good in those 3 volumes. They then came up with a volume, a book afterwards, saying it was called Chalcedon in Context, all right, which was a commentary by various scholars on the Council of Chalcedon, and it is scathing. These are people who are not Oriental.
So what are the accusations of the Byzantine or the Eastern churches towards the Oriental or the Church of Alexandria in this?
The hardliners in the Eastern Orthodox, they say 7 councils. Either you accept 7 councils or you're not Orthodox.
But what are they saying against us in this here? In council of
This is the faith. I'm saying the hardliners. The people that understand Chalcedon know that it was, it was a disaster. The ones that really know Chalcedon and studied it know that it was nonsense. Okay? But the problem is people aren't studying it from an academic or an objective perspective. They assume that this is the definition of faith. Even when they tried to correct it in their 5th council, okay, they did it very, how do I say, carefully, all right? And they still never accepted, they just tried to smooth over Chalcedon, okay? But they never totally rejected it. And then in the 6th council, it was worse than before. It was worse than Chalcedon. They themselves went back and forth. We stayed on the straight way. They themselves had their issues and they went back and forth and their arguments against each other. We're going to talk about all this in the next lecture. But I suggest we take a break. Okay?